All right, so how do you tell a true visionary from just like a really good con artist? Especially when you're talking about pharmaceuticals, where there's big money and groundbreaking science all kind of mixed together.
Yeah, it's an interesting question.
It really is. And the guy that we're looking at today, I think embodies that kind of question perfectly.
Okay.
Dr. Richard H. Roberts,
Right.
MD, PhD.
Wow.
He inherited a struggling pharmaceutical company and then ended up selling it for millions and millions of dollars.
Interesting.
But how he got there is a really fascinating story.
Yeah, and it begs the question, is this guy just really ambitious, or is he kind of a risk taker? Is he a genius or an opportunist?
Yeah, grifter or gifted? That's the question.
Exact.
So we've got two main sources for this deep dive.
Okay.
One is a really candid interview that he did on a business podcast. And the other one is, of course, the Wikipedia rabbit hole.
Oh, Wikipedia, you can always count on it.
Always.
Oh.
For a surprise.
So today we're going to kind of unpack his management style, which is a little unusual.
We'll talk about a decision that he made regarding employee stock options when the company was really struggling.
Interesting.
And then, of course, the big controversy of the drug colchicine.
Okay.
So by the end of this, you can tell us, is he a visionary leader or a master manipulator, or maybe a little bit of both?
I'm intrigued. Let's get into it.
All right, so let's start with this idea of management by wandering around.
MBWA.
Right, he called it MBWA.
Okay.
And instead of, just looking at reports and data,
Yeah.
he really believed in getting out there on the floor and seeing what was happening.
So he's a hands-on kind of leader.
Very hands-on. He would walk the floors. He'd be talking to everybody from the scientists to the janitors.
Interesting.
He was paying attention to details like, was the garbage piling up or was the equipment being maintained,
So what do you think that that's about?
Well, on the surface, it seems like he really cared about his employees. He wanted them to know that their work was valued and he was invested in the company.
Yeah.
He also expected his executives, these are people who are making hundreds of thousands of dollars a year,
Yeah.
to be willing to do any job, no matter how small.
So it wasn't just about appearances. He wanted them to actually be willing to roll up their sleeves.
Absolutely. He said, and I quote, "I'm not going to pay somebody $400,000 a year to sweep floors. But if a U.S. senator is visiting and the men's room is a mess, you better believe that executive better grab a mop."
Wow.
It's a little intense, right?
Yeah. So he wanted leaders with big egos, but not egotistical behavior.
Yeah, he wanted people who understood that no matter what their title was, they were all part of the same team.
That's interesting. Kind of a contradiction in a way, but I guess it makes sense.
Yeah, and this emphasis on loyalty, this idea of teamwork, really comes into play during a critical point in the company's history.
Okay.
So URL Pharma, the company that Roberts inherited,
Right.
was on the verge of bankruptcy. And Roberts was meeting with potential investors, really just trying to keep the company alive.
So high stakes.
Yeah, really high stakes. And in the middle of all of this, he makes a very interesting move.
What did he do?
He insisted on securing stock options for all of his employees.
Even though the company was about to go under.
Yeah, even as he was negotiating for his own stake in the company's future.
Wouldn't investors see that as kind of putting the employees ahead of their potential return?
You would think so, right? But Roberts argued that these were the people who stuck with him through the tough times. They didn't get raises. The facilities were falling apart.
Yeah.
He felt like he had a responsibility to reward that loyalty.
Interesting. And how did the investors react to that?
They were impressed.
Really?
Yeah, the lead investor actually later told Roberts that his willingness to put his employees first, even when his own financial security was at stake, that really convinced them to invest.
So it wasn't just a feel-good story. It actually played a role in saving the company.
Absolutely. And those stock auctions ended up being very valuable for the employees because the investment worked, the company was saved, and they all benefited.
Wow. So it's a reminder that things like loyalty and trust, they're not just nice ideas. They can actually make a real difference in the business world.
Yeah. And it shows how a leader's actions can really shape a company's culture. And speaking of culture, Roberts was really intentional about setting the right tone, even in small ways.
Like what?
He refused to gossip. He wouldn't tolerate off-color jokes.
So he was really trying to walk the walk.
Yeah. He even told a story about refusing to park in a handicap spot, even though one of his VPs suggested it.
Really?
Yeah. He said it might seem like a small thing, but even little actions contribute to a culture of integrity.
So he believed that his behavior, both public and private, would set the standard for the whole company.
Exactly. And this brings us to the colchicine controversy, which is where things get really interesting.
Yeah, let's dive into that.
Actually, let's just keep going because this is where the grifter or gifted question really comes into play.
Okay, I'm ready.
So colchicine, it's a drug that comes from this plant, and it's been used to treat gout for like forever.
Yeah, it's been around for centuries.
And for a long time, you could just get it as a generic medication. It wasn't even FDA approved.
Right, it was kind of like an old folk remedy that just worked.
And that's where Roberts saw an opportunity.
Mhm.
So URL Pharma, they put a ton of money into research and clinical trials, and eventually they got it FDA approved to treat gout.
So they took this old unapproved drug and made it legit.
Exactly. And with that FDA approval came 3 years where they were the only ones who could sell it.
Ah, so they had a monopoly on the market.
Pretty much. And here's where things get controversial.
Yeah.
They took this drug that was super cheap, like 9 cents a tablet.
9 cents.
9 cents, and they jacked up the price to $4.85 a tablet.
Whoa, that's a huge increase.
It's over 5,000%.
Wow. No wonder people were upset.
Oh yeah, people were outraged. Patients couldn't afford the medication. Politicians were accusing them of being greedy.
Yeah, it became a big debate about drug pricing and the role of the FDA.
Did the FDA's regulations actually create this problem by allowing companies to take these old, cheap drugs, get them approved, and then charge a fortune for them?
It's a tricky situation.
Now, to be fair, Roberts and URL Pharma, they defended their actions.
What did they say?
They said the price reflected the value of having an FDA-approved drug that was proven to be safe and effective.
So they were saying they weren't just exploiting a loophole, they were actually adding value.
Right. And they pointed to all the money they spent on research and development to get the approval.
But their critics weren't convinced.
No, they said the research costs were nothing compared to the profits they were making.
Yeah, it's hard to argue with that when you see a 5,000% price increase.
And it raises these ethical questions, even if legally they were in the clear. Was it morally okay to take a drug that was affordable and accessible and turn it into something that most people couldn't afford?
Especially when people had been using it safely for years in its unapproved form.
All right, so where do you land on this? Was Roberts a visionary who saw a way to improve an old drug and bring it to more people? Or was he just a greedy businessman taking advantage of the system?
It's tough to say. I can see both sides of it.
Yeah, it's not black and white. And to make things even more complicated, Roberts had this very specific approach to problem solving.
Oh yeah, what was it called?
When in doubt, delay.
When in doubt, delay.
Yeah, he believed in being really careful and taking your time to think things through.
So he wasn't one to rush into things?
No, he said if something doesn't make sense, you have to be comfortable not knowing all the answers right away.
Interesting. So he was okay with ambiguity.
He even gave this example of a competitor who filed a patent that made absolutely no sense from a scientific standpoint.
And what did he do?
Instead of just dismissing it as stupid, he and his team spent months, even years, trying to figure out what the logic was.
Wow, so he really believed in digging deep.
He talked to people at all levels of the company. He didn't just rely on his own analysis.
So did they ever figure it out?
He doesn't say in the interview, but he uses it as an example of how important it is to really understand the situation before making a decision.
So maybe that same approach is how he justified the colchicine price hike.
It's possible maybe he truly believed he was doing the right thing.
Or maybe he was just really good at rationalizing his actions.
Right, and this brings us back to the big question, visionary or opportunist.
Yeah, what's the verdict?
I don't know, it's complicated. And there's one more piece of the puzzle we haven't talked about yet, his faith.
Oh, right. He was a devoutly religious man, wasn't he?
Yeah, he became an Orthodox Jew later in life, and he credits a lot of his success to his faith.
That adds another layer to the whole thing.
So how does his faith fit into all of this? Does it make things more confusing, or does it actually help us understand him better?
Let's explore that in the final part of our deep dive.
Okay, so we've got Roberts, the loyal leader,
Yeah.
the guy who built a company on integrity, but then there's that whole colchicine thing.
Right, the ethical questions around the price increase.
Yeah, and now we're adding in this whole other element, his faith. He says it really guided him, but how does that fit in?
It's a really interesting wrinkle, isn't it? You've got this businessman who's driven by profit, but also by his religious beliefs.
It almost seems like they contradict each other.
Maybe not. Maybe it's in that tension where we can see who he really was.
He talks about his faith keeping him grounded and focused, but how does that line up with making a drug so expensive that people can't afford it?
Yeah, that's the big question. Did his faith actually influence his business decisions in a good way, or did he just keep those two parts of his life totally separate?
I wonder if that whole when in doubt delay thing was part of his faith too.
It's possible a lot of religions emphasize patience and taking time to reflect before doing anything.
So maybe his beliefs did shape how he ran his company, but then how did he square that with potentially hurting people by raising the price of colchicine?
It's a tough one. Maybe he really believed he was being ethical, even if it didn't look that way to other people.
Or maybe he was just really good at convincing himself he was doing the right thing.
That's possible too. So, after looking at all this, what do you think? Was Richard H. Roberts a visionary leader, or was he just out for himself? Grifter or gifted?
I don't think there's an easy answer. I mean, people are
That's,
complicated, right?
yeah, we're capable of doing good things and bad things. It's all mixed up. So,
Yeah.
what do you think our listeners should take away from all of this?
I think the important thing is to just think about it. Really think about what motivates people, about how ambition can be a good thing and a bad thing.
And to consider the consequences of our choices.
Exactly. There are no easy answers, and sometimes not knowing for sure is the best lesson you can learn.
So, keep asking those tough questions, keep digging deeper, and we'll see you next time for another deep dive.